And somebody's phone's ringing. I think, yeah, well, this is it. Thank you for having your phone ring, so I can remind everybody, turn your phones off. So welcome, thank you for coming to the library. I love September at the library because it is library card sign-up night. So I hope, or not sign-up night, sign-up month. You have all month to get yourself a library card. I hope you are all card-carrying library users. I know many of you are, but if not, please do stop by the front desk and we'll see if we can sign you up for one tonight. And I see Imani nodding her head. She's ready to go. So the library is the best bargain in town, and I'd be happy to talk to anybody about all the benefits of joining the library. And one of those benefits is that we get to have wonderful, wonderful programs. And we're in for a treat tonight, as you all know. That's why you're here. And I'm going to turn the microphone over to Tara O'Brien, our program specialist, and she will introduce our speaker.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out to Brooks. We're really pleased to be hosting Jay Craven tonight. And first and foremost, I just need to do a little bit of business. As Star mentioned, if you could please shut your telephones off. And then the other thing is that the restrooms are here, and the emergency exit is the main exit. And another thing you may see on your seat, there are little feedback forms. If you would take the time to give us some feedback, this really informs our programming here at the library. We really do take your words to heart. And I do my best to try to bring in programming that will just attract an array of different patrons. Okay, is that better? No? How's that? Is that better? Okay. So you got the telephones and the bathroom and the feedback form, please. That's just the business. And again, my name is Tara O'Brien. I do programming here. And we are so pleased to host Jay Craven through the Vermont Humanities Speakers Bureau program. In addition to providing public talks, the Vermont Humanities sponsors book discussions, programs, a wide array of literacy programs, and other humanity-related events. We're so lucky to have actually secured this program before a cease in programming for the rest of the year for the Speakers Bureaus. So we're really pleased to have Jay here tonight. So Jay Craven, for the past 5 decades, Jay Craven has written, produced, and directed character-driven films deeply rooted in Vermont and New England, including 5 films based on the work of Howard Frank Mosher. His latest film, Lost Nation, digs into the parallel stories of Ethan Allen and the pioneering Black Guilford poet, Lucy Terry Prince. In this talk tonight, Jay will describe working with actors such as Rip Torn, Tantoo Cardinal, Kristofferson, and Michael J. Fox. And he will share with us the satisfactions and challenges that come from a deep immersion into place-based films. It's my honor to welcome you, Jay. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, hello. Is this one working?
That's not
No,
working.
that's not working.
That's
This
not-
is working.
Yeah.
All right, so let's change the stations. Is this, okay, is this okay?
Yes.
All right. I see a number of my friends. We could spend the first 20 minutes introducing them. If they left, we wouldn't have anybody left. Not very many. Anyway, but greetings to everyone, and yes, many people from my long and I don't know what you would call it. We'll figure out at the end of the talk. I mean, Stephen Stearns actually donated the very first performing arts event that I ever presented. I lived at Gene Boardman's house for 20 years. So my colleague Michael Boylan from Marlborough College Mary White, the librarian, and the MacArthur's. I worked at shot two movies at their place. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. This is long enough that I can't, if I started going extemporaneously, we would be here for longer than we want to be.
That's
So
okay.
I've sort of, I've written it out and see how well I can deliver, because this is relatively new for me, telling my story. Although I'm also starting to write, well, I actually aren't starting, but I'm trying to finish writing a memoir, which once I stop making movies may happen. So we'll call this sort of my path to making Vermont films. When I started the recent round of research for Lost Nation, I thought I knew the Ethan Allen story pretty well. You see, it was May 1st, 1974, when my then partner, Patty Oldenburg, and I arrived in the darkened and weathered old farmhouse that leaned down a sloping hill above Joe's Brook in the Northeast Kingdom town of Passumpsic. And when I say leaning down the hill, I'm talking floors that sloped so steep that if you stumbled and weren't hanging onto the kitchen sink, you'd roll out the front door and into the night. We arrived late and camped out in the living room for our first night in our new old house. It was cold and damp. We looked everywhere but couldn't figure out how to turn up the heat. So we shivered till morning. The next day, I found my way to the dirt-floored basement where a giant old Sam Daniels iron furnace stared me straight in the face. I didn't know what to do with it, so I walked up the hill of our place to find Marvin Bailey, who sold us the farm. "I see a furnace in the basement," I said. "How does it work?" "Wood," said Marvin. "Lots of wood. There's no real insulation in the house, maybe some old newspapers in the wall. You just keep the furnace fed with wood. Lots of it in January and February, not so much now that it's May." I'd never imagined this. "You'll need a chainsaw," Marvin said. "The best place to get one is Peck Hardware in St. Johnsbury." Well, Peck Hardware occupied a big chunk of Railroad Street in St. Johnsbury, next to the bank and around the corner from Ned's Steakhouse, a distinctly local working-class place with burgers, sirloins, and the best French fries in New England. Another claim to fame, the Beatles stopped there for lunch in 1964, en route from Montreal to Boston. On my first foray into Peck Hardware, I met Zeke, a funny and knowledgeable store clerk with a throaty Vermont twang and poorly fitting toupee. Zeke advised me on the purchase of a new chainsaw, and he sold it to me for substantially less than list price. In fact, he did that regularly, which may be part of the reason Peck eventually went out of business. Zeke just sized me up, threw his head back, and improvised. "Well," he said, stretching out each letter, "let me see now, how about $62.50. I was expecting to pay considerably more, but who was I to argue? I grabbed a wad of cash from the pocket of my jeans, took the saw, and said I'd be back. Out in the woods, my new chainsaw easily slid through the old maple logs until it didn't. So I walked back up the hill to find Marvin. "You got to sharpen the chain pretty much all the time," he said. "All that hard maple dulls the tiny cutting blades pretty quick." Marvin took out his own file and showed me how to use it. "Before long," he said, "you'll wear them down the nub and you need a new chain." I felled a couple of old maples and cut about 20 right-sized pieces, and having no other choice, put them into the back seat of our red VW van that I'd driven out into the woods. The car wheezed and strained and belched dirty blue smoke until under the burden of the wood's weight. I reduced the load, but it proved to be slow going, heading back to the house every time I loaded a few more chunks of wood into the van. Our next door neighbor down the hill, dairyman Desi Stewart, heard I was in the woods and showed up for some good afternoon entertainment. He stood and watched, unable to hide his glee at my predicament. Then he offered me the use of his well-worn, red, stake-bodied farm truck to haul my wood. For a short time later, I found myself sitting in the front seat of his truck. "One piece of advice," Desi said. "I've driven a stick shift," I said. I learned how to drive on a 37 Dodge pickup. It's not as big and heavy as this, but it's a truck. So you didn't always live in the city? Asked Desi, still amused. No, I said, I worked on a horse farm as a kid, relishing the chance to show off my rural roots. Well, then maybe you've got a fighting chance, Desi smiled. Yes, sir, I said. Desi squinted as if to get a better look at me with my thick, long hair and the wrong kind of sweater to be wearing in the woods. My advice is to cut dead trees instead of live ones, he said, since you plan to burn the wood right off. If you try to burn green wood, it won't heat good. It'll be hard to get going, but once it does, it'll get so hot it'll burn your house down. Good advice, I said. Then I drove off into the woods, imagining what our house would look like on fire. What happened next was unexpected. Yes, I cut more logs, sharpened my saw like a pro, piled them into the best bed of Desi's truck. Once I had a decent-sized load, I jumped in the cab, started the thick, rumbling engine, backed my rig around my tight spot in the woods, and pointed it downhill and back to my house. I rolled down the very long and steep dirt road that led to our farmhouse and shifted into third gear to build up a little speed. I applied the brakes just above the turn into our dooryard, except the brakes didn't work. I pumped the brakes again, but the pedal went straight to the steel floor of the truck. On the steep slope down our long hill with my heavy cargo in the truck bed, I picked up speed quickly, and in less than a minute, I went from proudly hauling my first full load of firewood to careening downhill, out of control, at rapidly increasing speed. I had to make a quick decision and saw only one option. I opened the trusty truck door, stood on the sideboard, and jumped. I hit the rocky road shoulder hard, tore through a section of barbed wire, tumbled down a steep bank and into a clump of thorny bushes. The truck pretty much followed me, so I moved fast to get out of the way. I rolled to a stop, but the truck lurched out of control, rammed straight into a huge maple tree in Desi's still muddy pasture. My first thought, Desi is going to kill me. My second thought, why didn't the brakes work? Followed by my third thought, why does my right arm feel like this? To that question, I got a clear answer because it was busted in two places. I limped back to our farmhouse. Patty drove me to the hospital. Dr. Maurice Rowe set my arm in a plaster cast and sewed 10 stitches into my back where I'd ripped open my skin as I flew through the barbed wire fence. A kind nurse brought me some aspirin, but my arm hurt and I stayed pretty much awake all night. The next day, back home, Marvin came to visit and he asked me what I'd do with a bad right arm. Very new to the state, I had a sudden inspiration. I want to learn about Vermont history, I said. Then you need to go to Montpelier, Marvin said. They've got a museum there and you still got a good left arm. Marvin was right. I traveled to the Vermont Historical Society research room 2 to 3 days a week, sat for hours pouring through every book I could find, looking into the dramatic story of Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys, who fought off New York sheriffs, posses, and courts to claim and settle the territory. I wanted to make movies in Vermont. That was my dream in moving here. I wanted to be in a place where I'd meet people like Marvin and Desi, who were different from my usual friends. I loved movies. I'd been raised by a Texas grandmother who introduced me to motion pictures when I was 6 years old and went to live with her. And my grandfather, a notorious bank robber who would certainly qualify for a decent heist film all by himself, but that's another story. My Texas grandmother loved nothing better than Westerns and Tennessee Williams films, anything with gunslingers and distraught Southern women. She had no interest in Disney, thinking he was just in it for the money and had rendered unmanly male characters like Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse, who were poor role models for a growing boy. So instead of taking me to see Dumbo and Lady and the Tramp, my grandmother would stuff me into a red 54 Chrysler for trips to the local Roxy Theater to see films like Red River and Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. Then I came of age in college, inspired by the films I'd see every week during the golden age when films by John Ford, Charlie Chaplin, European directors like Fellini, Antonioni, and Godard could be found playing on any night of the week at the Exeter Street Theater in Boston or the Orson Welles Cinema in Cambridge, where Orson Welles himself showed up and talked to the audience. But getting back to Vermont, my broken arm, and my research on Ethan Allen, the quick update is my arm healed. I charted a circuitous path to be able to make movies and even got around to making an Ethan Allen movie, although it took 50 years to pull it off. Like I say, my path to making these Vermont films was indirect, risky, and complicated. First, I needed to get dug into Vermont. My first steps occurred exactly a year after I moved here when I started St. Johnsbury's Catamount Arts Organization, touring 16mm projectors and prints of foreign, classic, Hollywood, and independent American films to 5 rural, small northern Vermont and New Hampshire towns each week. I charge $1.50 for tickets, and the screenings were successful, so I spent the next 16 years building up Catamount Arts. Within a few years, expanded to both show movies and produce performing arts events. We booked a film every week and staged performances by, among others, Ray Charles, Johnny Cash, Joan Baez, Miriam Makeba, Miles Davis, B.B. King, Bob Dylan, the Merce Cunningham Dance Company, American Repertory Theater, Spalding, Gray, Second City, and Stephen Stearns. We started puppet shows every Saturday in vaudeville for kids. We started Circus Smirkus, turned St. Johnsbury's former post office into the region's full-time arts center. Along the way, produced a few documentaries, including one made with high school students that same week in 1975 that we showed our first film. The subject, a local Danville farmer who used horses to plow his fields, spread manure, and haul logs. The idea was to use the money we made from showing films to make films. The only problem, we didn't make any money showing films. We had to raise money to keep Catamount going. But that ultimately was the skill I needed, the ability to raise money and articulate a vision for community and culture in Vermont's Northeast Kingdom. I also wanted to mentor students. As I started Catamount, I also began teaching in the alternative Peacham School, where I showed the Catamount films, taught history, worked with kids to produce the school newspaper, and made short 16mm black and white narratives and documentaries with 7th to 12th graders. Today, 50 years later, this same mission guides us as we grapple with the same challenges, especially money. I also made a couple more documentaries during these Catamount years, including one narrated by Ossie Davis about the 1980 Nicaraguan National Literacy Crusade, also a documentary about self-taught Vermont outsider artist Gayleen Aiken. The Catamount Arts experience was an adventure with many hair-raising tales. I could tell one about coaxing a reluctant Chuck Berry to Lyndonville if we had more time. Not everything went smoothly. I had moments of controversy at Catamount, probably inevitable for someone working to break ground in the performing arts and film. On one occasion, during my first year of showing movies at St. Johnsbury's Frank R. Adams Elementary School, a platoon of respected local conservatives demanded at a school board meeting that I be banned from using town facilities, because alongside a screening of that anti-capitalist Orson Welles film Citizen Kane, we'd shown a short documentary, Vermont Speaks for Itself, that included a charge that large out-of-state corporations in banking and agribusiness were exerting inappropriate influence on Vermont's politics and economy. The school superintendent, Joe Kasperzak, backed me up, stood down the conservative protesters. Every time I presented Bread and Puppet Theater, there was a total backlash. And I got banned from one of the town churches after the puppet troupe hung a papier-mâché B-52 bomber from the chandelier mounted in the plaster dome ceiling of the sanctuary. The Vietnam War ended, literally, on the day I started Catamount in 1975, but it continued to cast a long shadow. During the first year of my film series, I showed Hearts and Minds, the Academy Award-winning documentary about the war. A number of people wrote letters to me and to the local newspaper protesting. Around 1982, I began a writers' series at the Athenaeum, the St. Johnsbury Athenaeum, and called it Writers Reading. It included lifelong activist and friend Dave Dellinger, who kindly agreed to read from his autobiography, In Progress, about how he'd driven an ambulance during the Spanish Civil War when fascists, led by General Francisco Franco, overthrew the Republican leftist government. Dellinger felt that if any war could justify taking up arms, it was this one. Yet he came back feeling that the use of violence was universally dehumanizing. He vowed not to fight, and he refused to serve in World War II. Turned down a religious deferment, was studying at the Union Theological Seminary at the time, spent nearly 3 years in jail for refusing the draft. Later, he was active in the peace and civil rights movements and was a close confidant of Martin Luther King. For his role as organizer of the anti-war protests at the 1968 Democratic Convention, Dave was indicted as a leader of the Chicago Seven. He was proud to be a direct descendant of Benjamin Franklin, the American revolutionary and anti-authoritarian. Dave's reading was packed, but loud protests again came my way from local conservatives demanding that I be barred from again using the Athenaeum. Fortunately, the librarians backed me. We like librarians. But then I presented Johnny Cash in Linneville, a complicated character politically, but also a folk hero to many, including conservatives. This improved my standing. I also staged a concert by Ray Charles, and conservatives didn't know that he also had performed in South Africa during the time many artists called for a boycott, which made him, I guess, a de facto conservative. But the fact that my old buddies on the left were demonstrating against me and against Ray Charles actually helped me in town. One important conservative business leader said, well, he brings artists like Joan Baez and the San Francisco Mime Troupe, but then he surprises us with Ray Charles and Johnny Cash. That's okay with us. Wow. Would we still be so lucky today? Though it did not stop the protests. I brought Pete Seeger to Catamount and was attacked by a former State Department conservative in the local newspaper who told me to, quote, watch my step. During the mid-'80s, a group of Vietnam veterans formed a troupe called the Vietnam Veterans Theater Ensemble, and they developed a play, Tracers, that was put on stage by the legendary New York producer Joe Papp and won the prestigious Obie Award. Tracers was created by a Vietnam veteran, Tom Bird, who came to St. Johnsbury to perform with the cast, all of whom were Vietnam vets. When Bird arrived in Vietnam in August '65, he says, quote, I really believed in what I was doing. I'd been raised to think all communists were the enemy. He began to change his mind when he killed for the first time and realized the horror of, quote, depriving somebody of everything you want for yourself. He went through the wallet of one of his victims and discovered photographs of his wife and children. That, he says, almost did me in. Bird claims he spent 2 hours on the verge of shooting himself in the leg in order to be sent home. He received an honorable discharge after 13 months in Vietnam and several more working as a drill sergeant at Fort Dix, New Jersey. There's a lot more to his story, but after college and some very hairy incidents, as he worked with a psychiatrist to calm his PTSD, Bird developed this play. I wanted to talk about Vietnam, said Tom, what it had done to me. No one in my family understood. They all thought I'd gone mad. Vietnam veterans poured out of the Northeast Kingdom's hills to see Tracers. Some were limping and many wore their fatigues and army jackets. The event was extraordinarily powerful. And high school students came. Mostly, they claim, because they were told not to. A number of them stopped by in Fuller Hall to watch the crew setting up the show, and they told the show's director that prominent school officials, including the headmaster, told him to stay away from the show. 60 students showed up, more than had ever come to anything else I'd presented. Several days later, I was in Washington, D.C. with my son, 5-year-old Sasha. We were visiting the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum when a message came over the PA system. Jay Craven, please come to the information office immediately. I did. When I got there, I was handed the telephone with Burn Your Mayo, a esteemed St. Johnsbury headmaster, fit to be tied, on the phone. Craven, you sandbagged me, you son of a bitch, and I'm not going to forget it. Well, what do you mean, I asked. The Veterans Theater Group went from St. Johnsbury to perform at the Yale Repertory Theater. The director was interviewed by the New Haven Register, and he said the students up here attended the show because they were told by their right-wing headmaster not to. Well, was that true, I asked. Yes, damn it. Because we've got vets in St. Johnsbury who aren't crybabies like these guys. I apologized profusely, said I'd wished he'd come to see the show because I felt he would have gotten something from it. He said he doubted that. But proud, fierce, conservative headmaster Burn Your Mayo became an essential ally through all of my years at Catamount. He held a fundraising party for the first big film, Where the Rivers Flow North, invested $6,000. There was something to learn in all this. As a public-facing figure in the community, it was important to challenge and engage the community, and to also respect the reality of who lives here, and realize that life is more complicated than ideology. By 1986, I got itchy to make a narrative feature film. I'd built this cool community arts organization, but it consumed all my energy, and I had to put off my desire to make movies. I'd learned crucial skills along the way in fundraising, marketing, producing. I met actors and musicians, some of whom would be my collaborators for the next 35 years. It was an unconventional path to making movies, but one that sort of worked and made sense to me. One reason it made sense is that I also spent those 16 years at Catamount earning very little money, but working to understand, connect, and serve my Vermont rural community. So when it came time to take the leap into narrative filmmaking, only one idea made sense, and that was to make movies based on the characters and culture of the place I lived and loved, and where I had paid some dues and earned some degree of trust. Lucky for me, I connected with the work of a writer from the same place, and that Northeast Kingdom writer was Howard Frank Mosher from Irisburg. I'd read Mosher's books, Disappearances and Where the Rivers Flow North, and loved both of them. Mosher's writing expanded my understanding and gave shape to my sense of place. And his stories played like the westerns my grandmother took me to. I could see it all now. Vermont westerns. I thought Mosher's Disappearances would be the film to beat all films, with its rollicking whiskey smuggling, high adventure, outlawry, and magical realism. I called Howard's home, and he was happy to hear from me, knew of my work in the kingdom, and suggested I contact his agent. I dealt with agents for performing artists, but I'd never thought about what was involved in optioning literary property. But here I was, talking to Howard's agent, Don Congdon. Don was an old world New York literary agent, born in 1918, set out to New York in 1935 with $8 in his pocket, started out delivering manuscripts and worked his way up the chain, first as the editor for J.D. Salinger, and then as an agent for Ray Bradbury, Lillian Hellman, William Styron, Russell Baker, Francois Truffaut, and Howard Mosher. I went to New York, and Don took me to lunch. He had a refined air and took me seriously, which made me nervous. He immediately dashed my hopes to make Disappearances into a movie. It's already tied up, he said, and you couldn't afford it anyway. How much are the rights? I asked. $100,000, he said. You're right. This would be my first narrative film. Why don't you take a look at Where the Rivers Flow North, Congdon said. It's a fine story, and I can make it available for less money. I said I'd think about it and went back to read it again. I was sold. The story felt like Ilya Kazan's Wild River and John Ford's The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, with the protagonist who resists changing ways of life. And apart from working with a horse and finding old-growth forests and needing to destroy a power dam and unleash the historic 1927 flood, I felt I could maybe pull it off. I called Congdon back, and we made a modest deal, the $2,500 per year option for 3 years against a purchase price of $25,000. I sent out notices to would-be screenwriters looking for a writing partner. 4 guys wrote to me, all of them friends, and I chose one. The other 3 became less friendly. But I hired Northeast Kingdom writer Don Bredis, and we started work. A year later, we submitted our script for consideration to the prestigious Sundance Film Festival Directors Lab, and we were named a finalist. I'd gotten an encouraging phone call from a New York indie producer, and she loved our script, but we didn't get selected. After the next year of wondering how to proceed, I decided I had to make a film. I'd partnered with a Vermont clown, Rob Merman, to start Circus Smirkus, which was terrific but had its challenges, okay. But I'd made documentaries and now wanted to make a narrative feature film. I thought about shooting a few scenes from Where the Rivers Flow North to show what I could do, and then called Howard to discuss the idea. Another idea popped in my head at the same time. Why not shoot a film based on one of Howard's short stories in the same book as Rivers? I like Alabama Jones, I said. It tells the story of a 19-year-old singer who rides into town to perform at the county fair. The narrator is a teenage boy who instantly falls for her and has the chance to leave Vermont with Alabama's show, but silently declines, deciding to remain in the Northeast Kingdom landscape that he knows. I told Howard the reasons I thought Alabama Jones would make a good trial run. The characters were vivid, production would be simple, we could pull it off in 4 or 5 days of shooting. Howard just looked at me. Sounds good, he said, not really meaning it. But I think you should go for high water. It would be so much more difficult to make. Well, Howard was right. High water was more difficult to make. But I wasn't sure that was a good thing. It tells the story of an 18-year-old farm boy, waterman, about to attend his first stock car race up across the border in Sherbrooke. And everything that can go wrong does go wrong. The story would present numerous challenges because Waterman hijacks the family farm truck and must load his 3,000-pound 1937 Plymouth Jalopy onto the back of it, something we had to pull off in real time, quickly, with the cameras rolling and approximately 2 inches of clearance on either side of the truck bed. 2 inches either way, and the valuable, borrowed, antique car would fall off the truck and crash. Plus, how do you create traction for the heavy car to ride up the steep angle into the truck? The only answer, heavy steel treads stapled onto 2 100-pound hardwood planks we hoped were sturdy enough to support the weight of the car, and that the car would stay on the planks going up. How could an actor handle these? Then we needed to build a wooden plank bridge to cross a teeming 60-foot wide brook, a bridge strong enough to support the monster truck and car, and light enough to be carried away in a flood. And we also had to create the flood. And don't forget that we needed the truck with the car on it to crash through the rotting wood on the bridge that we built, and then to create the flood strong enough to carry the bridge, car, and truck away. To say nothing of the torrential downpour we needed to create in an all-night scene where the boy returns to the farm, finds the bridge blown out by the flood, and decides in desperation to rev up the stock car in the ankle-deep mud and rain and ramp up the heavy planks to enable the 37 Plymouth to jump over the thick, raging, 60-foot wide brook. Howard showed up to watch us film this scene. As we deployed fire hoses and a deluge gun to create the downpour, I slipped and fell in the slippery mud constantly. Howard got more than a few good laughs out of our predicament. I don't have time to go into all the details, including a stubborn and difficult actor and a humiliating opening night in front of the Vermont Governor, Madeline Kunin. But suffice it to say, our experience making high water fully prepared us to make Where the Rivers Flow North, so I guess mission accomplished. Where the Rivers Flow North was a much bigger production, costing $2 million instead of the $50,000 we spent for high water. We raised investment money, $6,000 shares, by staging fundraising cocktail parties across the state: Burlington, Greensboro, Thetford, Manchester, St. Johnsbury. We miss Brattleboro. The more cocktails we served, the easier it was to convince folks to put up money. We had co-hosts for each event, including writers Wallace Stegner, Annie Proulx, John Michael Hayes, Alfred Hitchcock's screenwriter for Rear Window, To Catch a Thief, The Trouble with Harry, and The Man Who Knew Too Much. Wow. I asked Hayes what it was like working for Hitchcock at the event. He dipped his head and then said, "He's egotistical to the point of madness. And if you weren't talking about him, he wasn't listening." These events crackled with a sense of excitement, anticipation. This kind of filmmaking was new to Vermont. Michael J. Fox had a Vermont house at the time. He signed on to the project to help us get a $500,000 foreign sales advance. And he put $50,000 of his own money into the film. We searched high and low to find indigenous actor Tantoo Cardinal to play the co-starring role as Bangor. She was a dream come true, especially compared to the gnarly veteran character actor Rip Torn, who was all the demons of hell combined. Anthony Quinn expressed interest in the role, and my wife and producing partner Bess O'Brien and I spent 2 memorable days with Quinn, learning more than we needed to know about him and his 2 young female assistants, 50 years his junior. When I saw the New York Post headline a couple years later, I wasn't surprised. It simply said, "Zorba the Stud. Anthony Quinn fathers a child at 81. But we decided Rip was better for the part of the heroic, stubborn, self-destructive old logger who fights change in Where the Rivers Flow North. But he showed up for our first rehearsal 3 hours late. And later that day, after we visited the handsome young Morgan horse we'd wrangled for the shoot, he pulled me aside and spoke in a medium whisper. "Jay, we've got to talk." "Well, what we need to talk about?" "That horse," he said. is a homosexual. I didn't know how to reply. A man knows, Rip said. Just the look in his eye. What if I'm performing a scene and he suddenly decides to have his way with me? It would throw me off my game completely. I can't and I won't work with a horse, and that's the beginning and the end of it. I reminded him that he told me repeatedly that he got his start in the business with Tennessee Williams, who was gay. Tennessee Williams was not a horse. Rip's being difficult cost us the horse and several key crew people whom we lost because of his lashing out. All this was good training, I was told, for what was to come as a filmmaker. But we made the film. Rivers played the Sundance Film Festival, was a finalist for Cannes. We ran an Oscar award campaign, Academy Award campaign, encouraged by Hollywood publicist Dale Olson, who nearly got us a Golden Globe nomination until budding movie mogul Harvey Weinstein stood in our way. That's another story. But the film had a terrific run, still plays. It earned us letters of warm praise from Emma Thompson, Jack Lemmon, and Gregory Peck, who sent us a $5,000 donation that was actually delivered to me right in this room when it came by FedEx. I don't even know why it arrived here, but it did. I opened it, and it was a letter saying, I'm not going to play the lead in your next movie, Stranger in the Kingdom, because it's too much like To Kill a Mockingbird. But I love what you're doing, and here's $5,000. Anyway, when asked near the end of his life at a tribute event in Houston what his favorite film of all time was, Gregory Peck took a moment to reflect and said, well, this little film out of Vermont, Where the Rivers Flow North. Tantoo Cardinal is perfect, and Rip Torn has never been better. So he thinks. I was at the Cannes Film Festival with Rivers when I got word from Howard's agent Don Congdon that the rights had suddenly become available for Howard's novel, A Stranger in the Kingdom. I'd optioned Disappearances, was excited to finally get the chance to hopefully make that film, but who knew? I figured Stranger, with its murder mystery and racial drama, would have larger audience appeal. It had been optioned for years by producer Robert Chartoff at MGM. Chartoff had produced Rocky, Raging Bull, The Right Stuff, but MGM was going through hard times and never put up the money to make the picture. Congdon said the story rights for Stranger would be more costly, starting with $50,000 option. I didn't have the money. But the man sitting next to me at Cannes liked Rivers, took me to lunch, and wrote me a $50,000 check on the spot for the new picture. I was not used to this. It took 3 years to get Stranger ready to go, and Chartoff circled back and asked to be our producer. I said okay, but nothing developed. We decided to raise local money again and planned a public stock offering which required more government filings but lowered the cost of investment from $6,000 a share to $1,000 a share. Our lawyers promised we'd be ready to solicit and collect funds by April 1st, 1996 for a planned start date for production of October 1st. But our lawyers were wrong, and we weren't even allowed to start soliciting investment until November 1st, 6 months later, and a month past the time we needed to start production or lose the story rights. I had a small office in the barn on a piece of land Bess and I purchased in hopes of building a house there. I'd go there to work on Stranger's screenplay, cutting characters, trying to shape this dense novel into a nimble script. I debated, would I focus on the novel's nostalgic feel for the 50s in Vermont or respond to the dark undercurrents and tense racial dynamics in Mosher's fictional Kingdom County. I focused on the dark currents and hoped the story's many ironies would play for a few laughs. But back to the money. There wasn't any, and we needed to act now. So I called my friend Bob Soucy, vice president at the community-minded Vermont National Bank in Brattleboro. Bob had been supportive of my work and was giving Kingdom County Productions $25,000 each year to support film development that he thought was important to the region. He was our biggest regular angel. Bob, I said, I need $1 million. Well, Bob replied, sounds like we should talk. We did, and Bob wasn't scared, like I was, about our financial situation. He knew the Mosher novel, liked the idea of it being made into a movie. Within a week, he committed a $1 million loan secured only by the film. "Who do you have in the cast?" Bob asked. "Well, our name actor is Christopher Lloyd," I said. "He's committed to play the irascible boondocks outlaw Resolved Kinnison. His Vermont brother Sam Lloyd in Weston played the judge in Rivers and helped us connect." "Well, Christopher Lloyd should help attract an audience," Bob said. Bob's promise of the loan relieved my anxieties. I proceeded with plans to set up a production office in Chelsea, Vermont, and hire staff. I cast Ernie Hudson as our lead player, black preacher, and Air Force veteran Walt Andrews. Ernie's a charismatic actor who could express Walt's integrity and courage, which he needs when he inexplicably gets charged with adultery and murder. Ernie played the Black Ghostbuster, also the complex and powerful role of Solomon, the handyman with intellectual disability, who was used as a scapegoat in the dark narrative, The Hand That Rocks the Cradle. He's fabulous. I had a good meeting with Christopher Lloyd to discuss the role of Resolved. He signed on, agreed to play it, but then dropped out several weeks later when he got a better paying offer. This left us without a bankable actor. Then I met Oscar winner Jack Palance in an airport and followed up with an unforgettable phone call. He signed on, but then disappeared on a drinking bender into Canada, according to his agent. Matt Salinger was producing low-budget indie films in LA. He was a big fan of Where the Rivers Flow North, had grown up in Vermont as the son of J.D. Salinger. Matt asked to let him know if I needed help with Stranger, and at this point I gave him a call and FedExed the script. The same day he got it, Matt read the screenplay and left it in Martin Sheen's mailbox in Malibu. Martin read it overnight, called me to say he was interested in the role of Sigurd Moulton, the big shot Montpelier lawyer who prosecutes Walt Andrews for adultery and the murder of Claire La Riviere, the itinerant waif from Quebec who drifts into town thanks to rascal attorney Charlie Kinnison's prank invitation to her. Martin and his wife had liked Rivers, and Martin signed on to Stranger, offering to work for free. He simply asked that we also cast his daughter, Renee, which we did, in a small part, and his buddy Matt Clark, a veteran of many westerns who had directed Martin in the 1988 film Da. I cast Matt as the judge in our picture who oversees Walt's trial. Martin also required that I bring his lawyer to Vermont and asked me to agree to release him from the production if at any time he decided to get arrested for committing civil disobedience for any issue that he believed was important. I asked what kinds of issues those might be, and he simply said, "Many." I said, "Okay." Martin carried a large plastic trash bag full of candy bars, and he insisted that I eat the Hershey bars and Snickers with him every time he did, as a substitute for the tequila that had formerly been his primary vice, until he got sober after suffering a heart attack on the set of Apocalypse Now. Matt Salinger went to foreign sales agents he knew and secured a $750,000 advance based on Martin's involvement in the film. Suddenly things were looking up. With that money, $1 million loan, we'd be okay. We just worked to raise another $250,000 in charitable donations for post-production, and voila, another Vermont movie. Pre-production began, but just as we landed in Chelsea, the Vermont National Bank was bought by the Chittenden Bank in Burlington. And the guys at Chittenden did not like the looks of our movie loan. Why should they? To make a long story short, the funds were now held up when the new bank demanded that we get co-signers for the entire $1 million loan. I scrambled to do this by turning to long-term supporters. Then 4 days before the start of production, the bank upped the ante again by requiring that we collateralize all of the co-signatures with cash at 100% or securities valued at 130%, all of it delivered and held by the bank. I now needed to put my hands on more than $1 million in cash and securities in 3 days, or the film would collapse. With Ernie Hudson and the other actors in town, in 1950s cars rolling down Main Street in Chelsea, we hustled like never before and went to the phones to collect this huge amount of cash. And we did it. People believed in this Vermont movie. But then the day before the loan was scheduled to close, and 2 days before we were scheduled to start shooting, the Vermont Department of Banking and Securities challenged the whole deal, saying that the loan, now that it had to be collateralized with hard cash, was actually a securities transaction that would be prohibited under the law. We were sunk, not knowing what else to do. My wife, Bess, who had been raising bridge loans from our friends and allies, just simply tied us over until the loan funds were available, came up with the only idea that anyone could imagine. We need to call the governor, she said. Well, I'll leave that long shot proposition to you, I said. Plus, it's now midnight, and we meet with the Banking and Securities Commissioner at 8:30 in the morning. I'll see if his number's in the phone book. Remarkably, it was. Bess called. It was a short conversation that got right to the point. In our hastily called Montpelier meeting the next morning, the commissioner was equally blunt. We're not going to allow this loan. I made every case I could that we were already in motion, couldn't stop without a collapse, that we had a good track record because of rivers, that we'd stimulate the local economy in and around the port town of Chelsea, that we had securities offering that was about to break. The commissioner wasn't buying any of it. I'm sorry, he said, no dice. After a long silence, a knock came at the door of the conference room. An assistant poked her head in. Commissioner, the governor is on the phone. The commissioner stepped out, took the call, came back into the room. You can execute the loan and access the money today. We spent the day collecting the collateral funds in stock. We'd been saved, sort of. The production went forward while we continued to raise money, but we collected only a fraction of the investment equity that we had originally planned because of legal delays. Then the filmed scenes of our last 3 all-night shoots on Stranger in the Kingdom were completely unusable when our lights oscillated out of sync with our 35mm camera, causing fog all over the images. None of the film was usable. And we didn't know about it until our courier to the lab in New York returned by car with the news and the damaged film. It was too late to reshoot anything. People were headed home. It had been a rough, difficult shoot. We had have no choice but to reconvene the entire cast and crew in 4 months, which was the earliest that actors could reassemble, and then reshoot at a cost of more than $150,000. I started a 3-month negotiation with our insurance company who covered some of the damage, but it was a grueling reshoot of all-nighters. When you're done shooting, you want it to be over, though I got to add 3 scenes that actually helped the final film. Once Stranger was finally completed and released, the economic infrastructure that supported indie filmmaking collapsed. Our 1996 business plan crucially depended on the nearly $17 billion a year U.S. video business, with its 40,000 video stores that bought VHS tapes for $60 each and rented them to customers to make back their investment and some profit. Rivers had sold 48,000 videos at $60. We were able to pay back much of the production cost, robust foreign sales added to it, and then a foreign sales company went bankrupt, owing us $600,000 that we never saw again. But overnight, as we prepared to release Stranger, the video store giant Blockbuster announced they would no longer pay $60 for the videos. They'd only pay now $5. The nationwide network of mom-and-pop video stores and the smaller chains collapsed. Class action lawsuits against Blockbuster by other video stores failed, and Stranger in the Kingdom was released into this void and generated very little revenue except for European sales in France, Spain, and Germany. I questioned my next steps, whether to continue. I needed to take a break. I was offered a teaching job at Marlboro College, was glad to have it, since Bess and I also had a new mortgage. A summer later, while touring Stranger to a date in Middlebury, I met a budding writer at a local B&B, and he shared with me his 1970 coming-of-age novel, The Year That Trembled, about 4 high school buddies who rent a house the summer after Kent State, hoping not to get drafted and sent to Vietnam. I expressed interest in the story due to my own involvement against the war and the counterculture. Scott, the writer, asked if I thought his book could make a good movie. I said, yeah, sure. Within 3 months, he'd raised some money in and around Cleveland and asked me to write a screenplay and direct the movie. I did. After a couple of years on The Year That Trembled, I cooked up a super low-budget comedy, Windy Acres, starring Rusty DeWeese for Vermont Public Television, played 12 states, then a documentary on the lasting impact of combat on military veterans. I was still making movies, but would I ever get to make Disappearances? We did, starting in 2005, just 3 days before our story rights expired, and for which we'd already paid the full $100,000. We had to make it exactly then. We were raising funds for production through another limited partnership with $10,000 shares and speculated that we could squeeze the production down to $1 million. We couldn't. And that's another story. But we went into production, raising money as we shot, including from one tough hombre who lived and breathed money and struck a very hard deal that marginalized other investors and gave him total control of the film. This guy's from Brattleboro, but we won't go into it. Then, when we got through this difficult production, we discovered a deficit that our line producers apparently missed, ignored, or carelessly made happen, leaving me with $600,000 in debt. Despite all this, the experience of making the film was mostly charmed thanks to the film's lead, Kristofferson, who played our lead character, Quebec Bill Bonhomme. Kris was a rare figure in popular culture, supremely talented, successful, modest, always kind, and very generous. His vivid but plain-spoken songs capture the depth, heart, and soul of hard-earned experience in our own times. His lean, rugged good looks and gravelly voice made him perfect for John Sayles and Sam Peckinpah's revisionist westerns, Lone Star and Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. I knew he'd do something memorable in Disappearances. Kris's innate magnetism and intelligence allowed him to successfully play a dissipated rocker opposite Barbra Streisand in Frank Pearson's A Star is Born. He confided to me that he won the part against the other two finalists, Elvis Presley and Mick Jagger. Los Angeles Times critic Charles Champlin captured Kristofferson's distinctive quality when he called his sensitive romantic rancher in Scorsese's Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, quote, as comfortable as warm earth. Working with Kris was one of the great pleasures of my career. I'll never forget our first encounter when I received his phone call out of the blue. Jay, Kris Kristofferson here. I just wanted to call and say I've read your script that Matt Salinger sent over and I was born to play Quebec Bill Bonhomme. It's a gem, he said in his South Texas drawl, the Sam Peckinpah picture that got away. On the phone, Kris tore right into the script in full character, reciting Howard Frank Mosher's indelible lines. He instantly captured an essence of schemer and dreamer Quebec Bill as he turns to his beleaguered but mild-mannered son, Wild Bill. After every plan the old man has cooked up has ended in total disaster. Quote, ain't this the most spectacular trip you ever imagined, Wild Bill? Kris laughed out loud at Mosher's rich irony. I don't know what your plans are, Kris said on the phone, but if you'll have me, I'll wait as long as it takes to get this picture made. You can count on me. Well, it did take a while to wrangle the financing, 7 years, in fact. Truth be told, we only had $38,000 of our $1.3 million budget in the bank that Kris walked into my kitchen for our first day of rehearsal. And the actual budget would actually end up at $2 million. It didn't matter. Kris knew we were still raising money, but he was ready to dig in. Kris was with us for the whole run of our 8 weeks of rehearsal and production. He stayed at the new local Comfort Inn in St. Johnsbury and attracted curious local interest, including every time he took the local roads for his morning jog. People would just follow him. When Northeast Kingdom weather turned harsh or we fell behind schedule, Kris could always be counted on to lift everyone's spirits and know every other actor's lines too. But when the script called for his character to leap into Waterford's frigid duck pond during the fierce gun battle with the relentless Quebec whiskey pirate Carcajou, played by Lothaire Bluteau, I was worried. It was mid-April and the water temperature was 38 degrees. There had been ice on the pond a week earlier. It was midnight and I agreed to go into the water first to show Kris it wouldn't kill me. No need to do that, Kris said. I'm ready. I've been looking forward to this scene since we started. I took a quick dip, nevertheless, and came out colder than I had ever been. Kris laughed. Looks like this isn't meant for the faint of heart. That's the point, I said. You had quintuple bypass surgery. Hell, Kris said, that was 5 years ago. Like Quebec Bill, I stopped drinking. I run every day. I never felt better. Let's get going. So we did. We set up the shot with the crew shivering along the bank. Some were threatening to walk off because it was so cold. Action, I called. The camera rolled and Kris took the plunge, diving deep to the pond's bottom to retrieve a wooden case of stolen whiskey. A few seconds later, he returned to the surface, holding an intact whiskey bottle aloft. "I found the whiskey, Wild Bill. Ain't this great?" "Cut," I said. "That was fabulous, Kris. Come out of the water now. We've got blankets." "Let's do it again." Our 70-year-old lead actor said, "Give me just one more. If everyone's not too cold out there, I'll go underwater for just one more and come up again. I'll hold the bottle higher this time." Kris wanted to do this. I obliged. We filmed another take. He rose to the surface, and it was better than the first one. "That's it," I yelled. "Bring the blankets." Crew members and waiters walked into the pond and guided Kris to shore. I've never seen anything like this. Our talented production designer, Carl Sprague, built an authentic 1920s tavern set in the old St. J. Purina building. Quebec Bill comes to the place to seek information on the whiskey hijacker Carcajou's whereabouts. Everyone in the cast and crew was looking for this rare opportunity to be indoors for a change. Kris spent a day with my longtime composer, Judy Hyman, learning to play the fiddle in the living room of my house. Despite his extraordinary songwriting chops, Kris actually wasn't a great multi-instrumentalist, and he knew nothing about playing fiddle. Later that evening, after his fiddle lessons, Kris learned that his sister and only sibling, Karen, was near death. He would have to leave for a couple days that weekend to go to Virginia to be with her. But he insisted we shoot the tavern scene before he left. On the day of our tavern shoot, Kris brought his guitar to set. He fully rose to the rollicking spirit of the scene, but off screen, he was feeling blue. During the couple of hours it took to prepare the lights and camera and fine-tune the props and set, Kris sat in a straight-back chair in the shadows of the backstage. With people quietly coming and going, he gently played his guitar and softly sang ballads that expressed his unguarded sadness and deep love for his sister. He also sang Me and Bobby McGee and Sunday Morning Coming Down, but in a mournful tone. Karen died just a week later. Kris returned from Virginia, resumed hard work, and a few days later performed an unforgettable sold-out 2-hour concert at Fuller Hall in St. Johnsbury. It raised $25,000 toward our ongoing fundraising campaign to support the film. And despite suffering what he thought was painful fibromyalgia, that much later turned out to be Lyme disease. Kris came back to Burlington 3 months later to perform a concert there as well that raised another $40,000. The night before the St. Johnsbury concert, Kris called his buddy Willie Nelson to check in and tell him about his Vermont film, the benefit concert, and the fun he was having playing Quebec Bill. "So you're working for low-budget scale wages on an independent film in Vermont in March and April, swimming in ice water in the middle of the night, and now you're performing a concert for free so they can afford to pay you your measly $8,000. "Yeah, Willie," Kris remembered saying. "I hadn't thought about it quite that way, but yeah, that's what I'm doing." It's come to this, hasn't it, Kris? They both laughed. Disappearances had a good life in release, although we never saw a nickel due to the money deals we had to make to get us through the completion of the film. There is more to tell, more stories, more films, than a move away from private financing to my new model where every 2 years we convene 30 film professionals to mentor and collaborate with 45 students from a dozen colleges to make ambitious films for national release. We've made 6 more feature films through this model, so we're still at it and still taking the films on the road to live screenings with audiences. In fact, we're currently touring our Ethan Allen, Lucy Terry Prince film, Lost Nation, to our largest live regional audience ever. Of course, through all of this, and through these 4 films I've cited, my partnership with Howard Frank Mosher looms as the defining partnership of my professional career. It was through Howard and his nurturing ever-presence that I was able to charge into this gnarly work of narrative filmmaking, knowing that I was making films based on this beloved writer's work. I was not making a Jay Craven film, I was making a film based on Where the Rivers Flow North, A Stranger in the Kingdom, Disappearances, and yes, High Water, drawn from these playfully ironic and emotionally compelling frontier stories of Howard Frank Mosher. There could not have been a more nurturing, supportive, collaborative, inspiring mentor. Howard was always there, and his vision and spirit infused every minute of each of these films, plus Northern Borders. It was through this partnership that I learned to be a writer. I went on to write, produce, and direct 7 more feature films, plus a 7-episode comedy series. Comedy? I couldn't have learned comedy from Howard, too. Well, I actually did. Anyone who knows Howard can appreciate through his ready twists and savored ironies of life, place, and character. Howard and I also wrote an original screenplay together that will hopefully never see the light of day. Though it engaged us in 16 months of collaborative fun and constant laughs. After all of this, the question remains, why do we do it? And what would I say to a young, aspiring filmmaker who has this same dream? I'll close by quoting from Bill Kaufman's article in Orion magazine, which profiled me and our persistent work making films out in the hinterlands of New England. Quote, in 1915, the celebrated vagabond poet and pioneering critic Vachel Lindsay delivered a spectacularly wrong prophecy about the future of film. In his book, The Art of the Moving Picture, Lindsay predicted that soon enough, every community of 50,000 would develop its own motion picture coterie, whose locally produced films would express the genius and character of their particular place. Topeka, Indianapolis, Denver, each would find itself rendered upon the screen in this fledgling medium of the motion picture. This didn't happen. What if, however, Kaufman wrote, a filmmaker who lived far off the beaten path, say in Vermont, made a movie based on a book by his region's most acclaimed novelist, and then he made another and another, and what if these works looked and sounded, glowered and sang like their state, like sugar houses and mud seasons and hootenannies? It would almost be enough to raise Vachel Lindsay from the tomb. Vermont stories are worth telling. There is a population here that never sees its own culture, its own history, its own characters validated in the mainstream cinema. When a Hollywood film uses the region, it tends to caricature or stereotype us. Why not have stories told from where we are, about who we are? The Pulitzer Prize-winning poet William Carlos Williams was also a highly respected pediatrician and general physician, inspired by his ability to live and practice 2 parts of a whole, with each informing and drawing from the other. He also stayed close to home with his subjects, adding, quote, the local is the only thing that is universal. The movie industry is concentrated and centralized far away. It's mostly in Southern California, and where we live is invisible. Increasingly, it also renders manufactured and synthetic spectacle that bears no resemblance to life as it is lived. Sure, we get caught up in the glitz and glory of Hollywood, whose glamorous, larger-than-life characters render our more regular existences unworthy of the big screen. Bill Kaufman wrote that our Vermont filmmaking quest, quote, had come closer than any other filmmakers to realizing Vachel Lindsay's dream of vital regional cinema that embodies the character and genius of a place in all its mystery, magnificence, and pain. Imagine seeing your own place, its history, color, idiosyncrasies, secrets, and glories rendered honestly upon the screen. Imagine your children and your children's children growing up with the understanding that where they live matters, that their stories do not need to be transplanted to Beverly Hills or Manhattan in order to count. The commercial film industry says that folks in the hinterlands don't matter. We have worked to affirm the value of unacknowledged places, the villages, neighborhoods, and human-scale homes in which so many real Americans live, love, and labor, and dream and mourn. We believe that our history and culture are specific and matter mostly if they are rendered, explored, celebrated, and considered. My original mentor in all this, Howard Mosher, understood, expressed, and enlarged upon it. It allowed my own background in activism to find lifelong expression and meaning. I will be forever grateful. Our places will not flourish unless and until our artists turn their attention homeward and paint on the canvases of their own backyards. Myth and drama, tragedy and farce, every story we could ever hope to tell is waiting on the streets, fields, and backcountry where we live, work, and play. That's why I have worked to make this possible with so many supporters and collaborators. It's to show that we can do it, to provide an example to others, and that you can do it too. It won't be easy, but you'll have an adventure worth living. Bang. That's it. Did anybody has any comments, questions? I'm happy to take them. Yeah.
Who was the governor that got you the loan?
Howard Dean.
Okay.
Wheeler and dealer.
What happened to the Ford truck?
The Ford truck that's cracked up with my broken arm?
Yeah.
He just drove it away. It was like a tank. There was no problem with it. It knocked over a maple tree. No problem at all. Yeah.
How did you get the initial skills when you started making documentaries? Did you just try it and did it, or did you have some training somewhere?
Yeah, I picked up a Super 8 movie camera. When I was a senior in high school, a classmate made a Super 8 movie, and it sort of inspired me, and I got a Super 8 camera in my freshman year of college, started making these epic movies that I forced my friends to watch. I then was given I went to Vietnam as a student leader and activist in 1970, was given a camera also by CBS News to take footage. So that, I had to be a little more careful then, and I worked on making a Vietnam War documentary with some friends of mine, including John Douglas and Robert Kramer, who were living in Putney at the time. And I did take one class at the School of Visual Arts in narrative filmmaking, where I directed part of the film and was really inspired by what I was very excited about it, and it was a sort of film for which I was paid. It was a film for a place called International House in New York City, where foreign graduate students live. But I got a crew. I got to buy a Moviola editing machine. One of my college kid interns went on to become Tim Burton's cameraman and shot the Thin Blue Line and Batman and, you know, Edward Scissorhands, stuff like that. You know, and I came close to making a movie about Arthur Rimbaud and Paul Verlaine, the French poets. And it was going to star Patti Smith as Verlaine, as Rimbaud, and Richard Hell as Verlaine, who was a punk rock guy that worked at the same film bookstore I did in New York. And I just didn't feel confident enough to do it. You know, I got a small job as a sort of assistant on a film of David Maisels, who made Salesman and Grey Gardens and films like that. But moving to Vermont, I had no idea how I'd get there, and so I just sort of found this path, which was to present film, and then that led to performing arts, and what I really learned was producing. And ultimately, that was what I needed to know. If I'd known how to produce, I could have made the film in New York, but I didn't. And so that's what it was. In terms of technical skills, I mean, I used my own camera on my early films. I edited my own early films, and so I learned a lot from that, but I don't edit or shoot now, but I work with camera people and editors. Yeah.
So the dream you had, it was unlikely enough that you would be able to follow it to the success that you've realized by coming any place in Vermont. But you chose to follow it by going to the least likely place where you might succeed, which is the Northeast Kingdom. And I say that with all due respect because my father was born there. But why the Northeast Kingdom?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I decided to move to Vermont on a whim in October of 1973. It was the night of the so-called Saturday Night Massacre, when Nixon fired Archibald Cox, the special prosecutor on Watergate, and the Attorney General also resigned. And I said to my partner at the time, I said, let's leave New York. That was my response. And the guy that I was staying with, who was a poet, who lived in New York but had a place in Calais, Maple Corner, his name was Kenward Elmsley, said, tomorrow go to Morrisville, 20 miles to the northwest. Thursday, go to Hardwick, it's only 10 miles north. And on Friday, go to St. Johnsbury, which is 22 miles northeast. See which one you like. So he said, okay. So we went to Morrisville, it's okay. Hardwick, yeah, not really. St. Johnsbury, yeah, this could work. Went and bought a place that day. my girlfriend at the time had been a part of the pop art scene in New York. She was the former wife of Claes Oldenburg, sculptor. So we then went and found in her vault this fake fur piece that was made out of plaster of Paris on cloth and chicken wire, painted with enamel paints from the cheap hardware store down the road. They had a store in his early career, and it was for sale for $85. But she said, I think this one might go. So we took it to the Museum of Modern Art and got $85,000 for it. So that took care of it. Anyway, we stayed together for one more year. And she's actually, I just saw her this Thursday. She's still in the Northeast Kingdom too, but we split up after a year in the kingdom together. So, you know, just the idea was, I'm self-taught, really, is what it comes down to. But I loved film, and of course, in the late 60s, early 70s, film was so exciting, and, you know, there was Fellini and Antonioni, and those basic films showed you could do anything, didn't matter. And experimental film was big in New York, and so I tried not to mystify it too much. And then I made movies with these kids. I made 16mm spring Bolex, did hand processing, you know, didn't make prints, only ran the originals before the movies that I would show. So I got sort of familiar with it that way too. And then made a couple documentaries, yeah.
Whatever contact, indirect or direct, that you might have had with Norman Mailer, what was your reaction?
Well, I have a couple Norman Mailer stories. I once was put in charge of babysitting Tennessee Williams at an anti-war benefit at St. John the Divine Church in New York, where the featured performance was a play that Norman Mailer had written for Rip Torn, Nuts Old Rip, and Estelle Parsons. And I was sitting next to Tennessee, and I was just, you know, and it was an anti-war movement. It was a total disaster, the event. And somebody went through the crowd and collected all the money we were supposed to raise and went out the back door. None of the money actually got kept. And I sort of got suspected, but I had nothing to do with it. Anyway, so Tennessee did not like the Norman Mailer play. He stood up and said, "Norman, this is shit!" in the middle of the thing. Mailer is there and stands up and says, "Go to hell, Tennessee." And so Tennessee Williams, so then the head guy goes, get Tennessee out of here. Get him out of here now. So I had to take Tennessee Williams out of the place and make sure that Norman Mailer would not come and strangle him, basically. And just before the show, I had been photographed with Tennessee and Norman Mailer by Richard Avedon, who was there taking pictures that day. So that's one story I have of Norman Mailer. There are a couple others, but, you know, I didn't know him well, but I encountered him a few times. I mean, he was sort of, you know, man's man, gruff, sort of macho, and, you know, but would dare to deign occasionally to have a conversation.
Through Norman Mailer, did you have any contact with Anne Barry?
No. You know, Rip worked with Norman Mailer also. There's a clip online that you can find of Rip Torn chasing Norman Mailer with a hammer, threatening to kill him. They were doing a film together called Maidstone. And Rip was sort of a friend of Norman's, but they were both sort of, you know, phlegmatic characters. And so it was, anything could happen. But it's a pretty funny video. If you go YouTube, Norman Mailer chased with hammer by Rip Torn. Yeah. So I don't know. I didn't know. I had a friend, Michael Motion, who Stephen probably knows, who was a juggler, who married Norman Mailer's daughter, and he stayed close to me up in Vermont for a while. But that was about it. And I saw him also once in Provincetown at a play. And I think it was also, I'm trying to remember, maybe it was a Tennessee Williams play. I can't remember. Anyway, yeah, nothing too much. Any other comments, questions? Okay, well, thanks a lot for coming.
Oh my goodness, aren't we lucky? And I loved the quote by Rachel Lindsay. So inspiring. Don't forget to get your library cards. Also, we have videos of many of Jay's movies, and we also have books by Howard Mosher, and there are a bunch waiting for you at the desk to take home today.